in the entire world where we talk about emotional and narcissistic abuse and all the narcissistic abuse and content and books, more and more people I see are coming out about their stories. Famous people, regular people, and they're sharing in memoir form or whatever, blog form, stories of their relationships, what happened. They have a willingness to call out the patterns and see the patterns that happen in these relationships, which are often emotionally abusive, as problematic. And this is not a bad thing. It really helps to know that someone else went through something similar to you, and it can be very validating. Reading these accounts gives us hope. It may leave you feeling less confused, less crazy, less alone. And it helps. And while these stories, for many years, lifetimes, were often hidden by shame and stigma, we're now bringing these stories into the light. All of this is good. And I have to say, some of these worst stories are about people who have narcissistic parents. Because while we know that all forms of narcissistic relationships are harmful, it's the relationship that a person might have with a narcissistic parent or parents that are the most developmentally impactful. And even if as an adult, you have gone no contact or moved across the world, because ultimately these parental relationships shaped our psyches or our nervous systems or our identities, it can feel like a ghost. These relationships can feel like a ghost that we're forever trying to outrun. And we finally have people now who are writing about all of this clearly, their experiences, and they're even calling their parents' personalities out as narcissistic or antagonistic or toxic. All of this is good, actually. However, I know there's going to be a however in this video, there is a tricky balancing act with all of this. So several times, people have asked me about various books and essays and stuff written by people who clearly had either narcissistic or toxic or deeply, deeply manipulative, emotionally harmful parents. And the survivors who wrote these things, they wrote about the impact of these parental relationships. And then they would wrap up their book or their writing with a little bit about forgiveness, about finding a way to let it go. Basically saying, I had a narcissistic parent and I survived it, and now I'm doing better. Because nobody writes a memoir while things still suck in their lives. We tend to read memoirs by people who finally landed, found some resolution, figured it out, are doing okay or even very successful. And maybe still struggling in their fashion, of course, with post-trauma or other mental health issues or insecurity or self-doubt, but no longer are in the acute throes of it all. And like I said, have managed to turn their lives around largely. But I have to say, more than a few times I read these, I let it go, I forgave, I found compassion for them, I found my love for them kind of memoirs. Sometimes I've read these memoirs or essays. Other times people who read them told me about them. And when they tell me, Dr. Ramani, how do you feel? What do you think when the person writes about this? They wrote about their narcissistic parent, how they let it go, and they moved forward, and they found love in their heart, and they forgave, because that often confuses survivors. When people ask me that, I ask them one question. Is that parent that they're writing about in that memoir dead or alive? And almost every time when it's a big old story of forgiveness and letting go, the parent is dead. Listen, something magical doesn't happen when a narcissistic abuser in your life passes away. You don't instantly heal. You don't necessarily feel an instant sense of relief or joy or release. People will say that in the wake of the loss of a narcissistic person to death in their life, it's a complicated mix of emotions, and these emotions happen simultaneously. Shock, grief, sadness, anger, relief, guilt, regret. And for the time afterwards, it's a rather complicated landscape of grief. We see the usual stuff, the denial, the anger, the sadness, but tinged with a sort of what if, which grief experts would call the bargaining of it all, the wondering, more anger, the how could they, the I guess they never did change, the I will never get that chance to tell them what they did, and then slowly the acceptance and the realization that that parent would not have listened anyhow. There is a loneliness and isolation to these grief processes because there are often still enough enablers in the family or people that knew the person who all put on their mourning clothes and do the whole funeral thing. And it is typically not considered appropriate to share your relief at someone's passing at their funeral, or certainly not to call them toxic. So people going through this, they'll feel guilt about feeling relief at, for example, their parents' passing. And then as more time passes, and that relief and the sense of freedom and that no contact now is no longer feeling like you have to do this deliberate action of not contacting someone, but instead they are no longer ostensibly contactable, nor can they really contact you. That's relief, and it's release. And it may also be that your life is easier now because you're not having to manage them or be involved in caregiving or arguing with family members about them. Things lift after some weeks of that grief. And as part of that process of death and loss, I don't second guess that some folks then may be able to feel and experience a sort of new narrative around their narcissistic parent, of being able to rewrite the story in a different way, perhaps even feel a sense of forgiveness or letting go or less anger now that they've passed away. And then may shape this new narrative as, I'm healed and I forgave and I let it go and I found grace for my parent. And the sort of unspoken follow-through is then, so you too can heal if you forgive and let go and find grace. The only difference is your parent may still be alive. But here's the problem. Like I said, it's probably not going to work for you, or at least not work in the same way, if your narcissistic or toxic or emotionally abusive parent is still alive. The people who have these deceased narcissistic parents, yeah, sure, there's definitely still healing they're doing, and there are wounds and scars that remain, but new ones aren't being created by that parent. And emotions such as guilt, like, ugh, it's holiday time again and I want to avoid them, or I can't bear the thought of having to call them, or having to endure the parent's manipulations, things like the parent saying to you, you owe me, why didn't you visit me, you're selfish, you're greedy, on and on. Dead people can't do that. I mean, certainly their words may play through your head after they are gone, but it's not literally happening. They're not sending you a text or calling you up on the phone. People with still alive narcissistic parents are still enduring the real words in real time. Healing from having had a narcissistic parent is a tough one because you are having to do a few things at the same time. You're having to continue the battle of individuation and autonomy after a childhood and an adolescence where you just didn't get the stuff or even the permission you would have needed to become your own person. You're managing the guilt and shame that comes from having had one of these, and still having, frankly, one of these parental relationships. You're managing seeing how this kind of an early relationship created risks for this happening again to you in adulthood or in other relationships. So you may have found that your parent relationship wasn't the only narcissistic relationship you've had, and now you're having to heal from those relationships, such as marriages or other close relationships. And as a result, when that narcissistic parent is still alive, other people's narratives of, oh, I found peace, I let it go, I forgive, may feel hollow and may even feel shaming. And obviously, shame is second nature for survivors of narcissistic parents. So when you read the book about the person, and they write their whole long story about their narcissistic parent, and then they go on to say how they've healed and they've forgiven the parent, it can leave you feeling and wondering, why can't I do that? But you need to read their story fully to get to that essential point. It may not be a similar story to yours if their parent has actually passed away. I have no doubt that these memoirists and writers who are sharing these stories went through very complex stories of harm and grief upon the passing of their narcissistic parent. But those of us as readers and even the writers have to be careful and recognize that the process of healing and integration for a person whose narcissistic parent has passed away is very different from the process for a person whose narcissistic parent is still alive. Even from the logistical front, a person with a still alive narcissistic parent may still have a pit of dread, guilt, or anger at having to, once again, for example, juggle a painful and triggering holiday season, or have to endure the critiques of family members if they go no contact or low contact with that parent, or the grief that is activated if they do maintain contact with that parent. Survivors of narcissistic parents, where the parents are still alive, often have to occupy two worlds. One world in which you are able to be a full-on adult and be competent and pay the bills and have your lives, and the other in which you recognize that you were nothing but an object to the parent, who never noticed you unless you were a convenience, unless you were bringing supply, and you were trained to be supply, and that everything that you achieved was hard-won, and yet after all these years, you probably may still not be able to appreciate your accomplishments fully. Having a narcissistic parent leaves us forever feeling like an imposter. And having to see the parent, or even having to hear about them, can remain a painful reminder for survivors, and one that we're often torn in two about. That whole back and forth, do I not see them? Do I see them? Will I regret it? Will it upset me? And there's never an easy landing space with this. To have a still living narcissistic parent is forever living in that precarious middle ground. As long as a parent is alive, you will be managing not only the difficulties, but also a sadness and a grief. And while the world may want to pressure you to forgive your narcissistic parent, you are still living through the collateral harm. And sadly, the longer this parent lives, the harder this is. And the more, there's a possibility while grief will be complicated, there will also be some relief upon their passing. And listen, folks, I've been doing this work for a long, long time. And in this time, every person I've ever worked with clinically who had a narcissistic parent who passed, their primary emotion was relief. They were also able to tell and reflect on their stories in a more coherent way because they weren't still grappling with it. Dead parents can't guilt you into showing up for Thanksgiving dinner or cajole you to call your deadbeat brother. Sure, you may carry their internalized voice, but it can't compete with their real-life one. For example, a real-life phone call that you feel guilty about avoiding. And when your narcissistic parent is still alive, it's also about dodging the many voices around you who don't get it and who say, oh, come on now, your parent's getting old, your parent's getting older, don't you want to call them? You'll regret it if you don't. And that feels plausible. You do struggle with, will I regret it, will I not? So while people sharing, writing the stories about their dead narcissistic parents may be interesting, the end of their stories may not be relevant to those of you who are dealing with very much alive ones. And listen, there are some memoirs out there like Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died that speak to the healing that could only happen after the parent died, and don't get mired in the whole forgiveness narrative. But there are many, many, many more of these stories that are written this way that share that story of forgiveness. And that can mess with a survivor's head who is still often well into their own old age in their 60s and 70s and still having to manage the demands of a narcissistic parent who's in their 80s, 90s, or even their hundreds. And remember, narcissistic folks do seem to live a long time. And it could very well be because they're not having to live with the stress of dealing with toxic people in the same way as the rest of us. There may be something there, and all those longevity wellness folks, you may want to give up your cold plunges and just focus on building up your narcissism more, and then you may really live longer. Every story that a survivor shares absolutely helps us understand our stories a little bit more and reminds us that we're not alone. However, we have to read them with sort of a trained eye, because some stories may also evoke shame. So be careful that you understand that the experience of someone who is in, for example, a narcissistic marriage may not always be informed by someone who got out of one, and after getting out, may be able to write about and see the virtues and traumas of their narcissistic ex. In the same way, the stories of people whose narcissistic parents have died and they're finding all kinds of forgiveness, that may not help those who are still navigating the subjugated territory of managing very much alive narcissistic parents. The stories of those who went no contact with an entire family system may not provide those who don't have that option or desire, frankly, with the tools that they need. It's important to recognize that while all these stories are somewhat similar as to the effects that these relationships had on us, they're different in terms of the approaches we take, and especially relate to whether or not that narcissistic person is alive or not. And then there are the dozens of subtle factors around that. The severity of the narcissism, the subtype of the narcissism, the kinds of supports around you, the resources available to you. You know the drill. Above all, survivors of these relationships grapple with guilt, grief, and shame no matter what decision they make. Stay, go, contact, no contact. And forgiveness often doesn't work for most survivors. You can't share these feelings, though, with most people in the world because most people don't get it or don't want to get it. And memoirs and first-person accounts that suggest that you can find all this love in your heart for a narcissistic parent after they've passed away can often fuel false hope for those who have narcissistic parents that are still alive and with whom they're still in very unhealthy cycles with. There are no formulas to healing. There is only understanding that what you are experiencing is real. The way you were treated wasn't okay, and there's no backstory that can explain it away. These patterns tend to be consistent over time. Everybody, no matter who we're dealing with, when we've been feel wronged by someone, we want that deathbed confession, and it almost never comes. And you can lose a lot of life waiting for it. So when you read a story that is full of forgiveness and let it go, and you read it and you're thinking, am I a bad person because I can't let it go, and I'm dreading seeing my narcissistic whomever it is, fill in the blank, for dinner next week, next month, read the story carefully, because when a person is no longer here, there's a very, very different story we write about it. And so the way you navigate this and cope with this could also be quite different. And whether you go no contact, stay in contact, whether you forgive, you don't forgive, those are very personal decisions. But we really do need to be thoughtful consumers of other people's stories. I think there's wisdom, and I know there's wisdom in all of these stories. But sometimes we may read them and scratch our heads and say, And some of that can mean that your stories, at least at this point in time, aren't the same. But as time goes on, you might learn that, okay, at least I know I'm not alone in this. But also recognize that none of these stories are exactly ever going to be the same story and the same resolution. I hope that gives some clarity, and thanks again.